Y la del Congreso.
La del Congreso.
Bueno, la veo agitada, como era de esperar.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're very, very pleased to have this event on Venezuela this afternoon. And I'm not about to monopolize the whole time by speaking myself. You didn't come here to hear myself. We'll begin with the introductory remarks by John Walters, who is Chief Operating Officer of the Hudson Institute and the Director of Hudson Institute Political Studies. From 2001 to 2009, he directed the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. In that role, Mr. Walters guided all aspects of federal drug policy and helped build critical programs to counter narco-terrorism in Latin America. And without any further ado, Don John.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Daremblum. It's a great pleasure for me to join my colleague, Jaime Daremblum, here for this important session. As he explained, my knowledge of Latin America is a little distorted because I've done most of that work in government on the issue of drugs and security, rule of law, going back to even the Reagan administration in various capacities. But in that process, I've met very many brave and wonderful people in the region who are fighting for justice, rule of law, a better future for their families and their fellow citizens. Some of them, in the course of that, of course, have lost their lives to violence, to corruption, to crime. And unfortunately, some, of course, continue to do that today. We're today going to be able to discuss, frankly, some of the challenges in Venezuela, which has been racked by decades of destructive political forces. I think anyone who knows the region and sees this has been heartbroken by the continued and sustained destructiveness. There's much that might be done and should be done to help to move reform forward that I know this program today and some of the speakers will touch on. But we at Hudson have tried to continually work on issues of individual freedom, rule of law, justice, prosperity, and tried to work with our allies in the international community and give voice to the concerns that should be more visible to us all. And I want to thank Ambassador Daremblum and our panelists here, who he will introduce, for giving us the benefit of their knowledge and the ability to do this work. We could not do it without people who know what's going on the ground. So thank you all. Thank you for being here, and I won't get in the way of the rest of the program.
We will now hear from our main speaker, Don Javier. I'm trying to find your full name. Don Javier Corrales from Amherst, where he is a professor of political science. Javier is an old friend of Hudson. He has been in numerous programs that throughout, since we started doing this project in 2005, and he has been always he provides enlightenment and provides us with tranquility in our work, quote unquote. Without any further ado, Mr. Corrales.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Let me get my computer and get set up here. Excuse me one second. Just wanna. So essentially, if I want to move forward, I do this, right? Perfect. Okay. Great. And everyone can hear me? Yes, the volume is okay. Sorry. The entire.
We could see better from people on the side of the
There's another. Is that better? Does that help? Yeah. I don't think I can move this.
And what about us? Yeah. What about us?
Right. I love it. Everybody's making accommodations for me. Great treatment. Thank you very much. Great. So what I would like to do is to discuss, as the title of the talk conveys, the resilience of the Maduro administration and why this is puzzling. Let me begin by saying that it could very well be that Venezuela represents the most challenging political and economic crisis in the Americas, not just today, but in a while, and probably in the world. The crisis hasn't reached bottom yet. It could get worse. But I think most people who focus on the issue, either full-time or part-time, come out of this situation thinking that this is a real mess. The economic numbers speak for themselves. And so the reason why this is a mystery topic is because one would have expected, given the seriousness of the crisis in the country, one would have expected this regime to come down somewhat. Not necessarily to come down in the direction of the opposition, but at least some kind of crack. And the Maduro administration has been governing Venezuela for 4 years, and it doesn't seem like it is in imminent danger, although anything can happen. And so I want to talk about what might be sustaining the regime. I will organize my talks very briefly at the very beginning, talk a little bit about the context, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the Venezuelan situation today with other crises in Latin America where we have seen interrupted presidencies, where administrations had to come to an end before their terms expired, and compare Venezuela with those other cases in order to be able to provide some insights into what is sustaining the regime. And I think it's more useful to do that comparatively. So first, a little bit of the context. The economic crisis in Venezuela. Venezuela today has it manifests the 4 most serious economic problems of the 20th century. One has been the populism of South America that produces high inflation, capital flight, and high debt. Big time in the 70s and 80s. We thought it was a thing of the past. Venezuela has that now, with the highest inflation rate in the world, and now for several years among the top. It also has the problems of command economies. During the Cold War era, we had a lot of command economies, and we knew that the problem there was scarcity and a collapse of domestic production. Venezuela has those. Hyperinflation plus debt, and also scarcity and bread lines and long lines. Number 3, the problem that we observe in the way that neo-patrimonial societies in sub-Saharan Africa operate, in which the state collude with illegal forces to run illicit businesses, very much part of post-colonial neo-patrimonial sub-Saharan Africa. Venezuela is a perfect example of it now. There is a lot of evidence that the state is in collusion with actors who operate outside of the law for profit. And finally, it has the typical problem of petrostates, which is a completely non-diversified economy that, in addition, tends to be enormously non-transparent. So there you have it, right next to us, a 3-hour flight from Miami. We have all the terrible problems of the 20th century combined in that little country. And yet the regime survives. So why? How has this administration managed not just to deliver this set of crises, but survive? So let's look at some of these slides, and we can discuss them at the end. I know that the print is very small, but let me just give you the information here. What you have here is all the administrations in Latin America that since 1984 to the present have had to abandon office for one reason or another. There are 20 in total. At the bottom, I have Maduro. He hasn't abandoned, but I'm going to do some comparisons. And there you have it from, Bolivia in 1985 all the way to Brazil 2016 with the impeachment of President Rousseff. Now, they have come to an end through a variety of types. And that's what, let me just give you the kind of pressures that we have seen. Either a coup or military pressure. We have 4 cases. Resignations, typically that involves military pressure as well, but at least let's just say the civilian authority decided to resign. 6 cases. Impeachment or threat of impeachment, 6 cases. President pressured to shorten his or her term, 2 cases. A combination of resignations and coup, 1 example, and a combination of an impeachment with a little bit of a pressure, 1 case. And that gives us 20 in total. That's the universe. And let me now give you an idea of what scholars have said is around this universe of cases. What are the factors that prompt these early terminations? And here I am borrowing substantially from work done by other scholars. Some of you may know them: John Kerry, Aníbal Pérez-Liñán, Leif Marschentredet, or Mariana Llanos. So I'm going to summarize the scholarship. This is not work I've done, but summary that I'm doing. Now, I'm going to go through a list of issues that prompt these. And do I have a laser beam here? Is this
It doesn't work right on.
It doesn't work, okay. All right. So the first thing that I want you to notice is that some of the most important variables don't seem to be constant. 3 of the most important variables is there has to be a constitutional crisis. And so we have yeses for the cases that meet those conditions, or a military crisis, or a type of an electoral crisis. Something went awfully wrong during the election. And there doesn't seem to be a pattern when you just look at these 3 triggers. But scholars have digged in further, and they have found that, well, there are more causes to these crises, and they have added to the list. And so new research has tried to find more supporting conditions for these crises. And the list here expands. It now includes a very serious economic crisis of some sort. This variable is definitely much more frequent. Whether oh, great! I love it. Thank you. Another important condition is whether the president is minority in Congress. This seems to be almost an incredibly common condition. The president, this is what Pérez-Liñán would call, the president loses its legislative shield, and some form of street protest that overwhelms the country, and finally, major defections from the ruling party. So this is different from having a minority in Congress, but you also see defections. Now, the first thing that I want you to notice from all of this information, and I realize that it's a lot, is that it's not easy to bring an administration down. One factor alone won't do it. For the most part, you need a combination of factors. You need an alignment of many terrible crises happening simultaneously. And so it's not necessarily a good thing to see something like this. Normally, an interrupted presidency is a sign of a lot of things going wrong. Let me say that the problem with this study is, of course, if there are political scientists in the room, they're going to be criticizing me rightly because I'm just looking at cases based on the dependent variable, and I agree that this is a limitation. But at least we can see what is the commonality of these otherwise very different cases. And they're not that rare. We have seen 20 out of 129 administrations. And as I was saying, They are hard to come by. Cases that have fewer than 3 factors, 0. Cases that have fewer than 2, that have 3, 2. 3.51, and the majority have 4 factors going for it, sometimes even more. So there needs to be a lot. What is interesting, and now let me go directly into Venezuela and stop the theory and the comparison, is that by all counts, Venezuela today meets definitely 3 of these conditions, probably 4. I am now comparing here the Maduro situation today, which is here, with other situations in Venezuela where there was an interrupted presidency. Chavez in 2002, remember when he was briefly removed from office and returned to office? This is perhaps the most amazing coup I have seen in my life. Not because the president was taken away. We see that often, not as often in Latin America, but because the president was returned. That you don't see a lot of. And then the case of Perez in Venezuela in 1993 when he resigned facing impeachment threat, and Gallegos in Venezuela in 1948. And so here are the conditions that these cases meet, and at least we can be sure that Maduro has the problem of a major electoral crisis as a result of the defeat in the National Assembly elections at the end of 2015. You have a harrowing economic crisis, and it's a minority in Congress. So it has this much. And one could argue, is there a 4th condition? And there was for a while street protests prevail in Venezuela in 2014, but they have subsided significantly. So in many ways, it hasn't reached the point where it becomes more likely than not. This is the first lesson, is that it seems that things are very bad, going badly, but maybe it's not there yet. Perhaps if we see one of these other conditions emerge, the return of street protests or a military crisis, maybe we might be closer to a break in the administration, but perhaps we're not there just yet. Let me say a few more things about this and then offer some additional thoughts on what else might be sustaining the regime. So one of the things that the Maduro administration has done remarkably well, considering how much incompetence surrounds the running of this government, is to try to prevent some of these potential additional crises that could surface. And if you indulge me a few minutes, I would like to discuss several of these strategies followed by the administration, how I see them, what they have done right, and what are some of the vulnerabilities. And the first one is how they have avoided a constitutional crisis, how they have avoided a typical situation in which you have a major dispute in the country about whether the government is violating the Constitution. Almost everybody who is serious knows that the government is no longer in adherence with the most important precepts of Venezuela's Constitution, and yet this doesn't produce a crisis. And the reason is because Maduro has perfected something that we didn't see in previous cases in Latin America, which is, to borrow from Aníbal Pérez Liñán's term, what I would call judicial shield. It has pretty much changed the constitutional the composition of the Supreme Court to make it another branch of the executive branch, and so since 2015, essentially since 2014, the courts side with the executive branch on every crisis, and what they have done essentially is to eliminate the autonomy and operation of the National Assembly, which is where the opposition has some degree of political presence. So they have acquired this judicial shield that they deploy on every decision, from the most trivial to the most significant, such as, should we have an election? The president decides we're not going to have an election for a recall referendum. The court says that's perfectly valid. The president wants more executive powers. The court says that's legal. The opposition says we're going to try to pass a law to release prisoners. the court says they are acting illegally. It's a great tool, and it's not going to go anywhere. The court is not fracturing, and it's operating, and it is being observed. With the military crisis, what I think many of you in the room may know much more about this than I do, but it is very important that we understand how, starting under Chavez, but especially under Maduro, this has become a sort of military junta government. The military, the high echelons of the military, not only control important parts of the cabinet and the public administration, they not only control the distribution of food and the way that food is being distributed by private markets, but the military has also become an important actor in the drug trade. There has been a recent report issued by a former judge, Mildred Camero. It came out a few days. It doesn't have a lot of evidence, but it has plenty of circumstantial evidence saying that there has been a real change in drug trafficking in Venezuela. Not that there is more, but that now it's really led by the security apparatus. There is plenty of evidence to suggest that ever since the military was given the role to investigate drug trade criminal issues in Venezuela, they have used that type of information to also become involved in this operation. So what you have is, the key point is what you have is a government that has been given to the military both its legal dimensions and its non-legal dimensions. They are the custodians, and so the military has a huge incentive in preserving the status quo, or if you will, a huge incentive in preventing outsiders from coming in and investigate what they have been up to. Their complicitness in this type of governance is so deep that they are now feeling they need assurances that if for some reason there is a switch to another team, that they themselves are not going to pay a heavy price. And that's a hard challenge for Venezuela. But it's a strategy on the part of Maduro to get the military to be that compromised. With electoral defeats, we have seen the result is we're not going to have elections. The era of multiple successive elections under Chavez is gone. Now they're going to try to postpone them, and if they hold them, we're going to see far more irregularity. Here, the regime is behaving like a classic autocratic regime, playing every possible trick to undermine electoral politics with great success. This issue is, of course, the issue that has scandalized the OAS Secretary General the most, because it's such an egregious violation of democracy when all the steps exist for elections to take place and the government decides that they're not going to hold them until further notice. That seems to be a threshold that very few Latin American countries cross nowadays, but Venezuela did. With the economic crisis, I already talked about the depth of the crisis, but remember a point that political scientists always make, which is economic crises do weaken democracies and produce instability and might precipitate early termination of presidencies, maybe even transition to autocracies. But they don't have that kind of a devastating impact on autocracies. Autocracies, by their very nature, have the ability to survive economic crisis. We see it over and over again. Only those dictatorships that have a very strong connection to certain market forces might suffer, but so many others find ways to insulate the key pillars of the regime from the crisis and create clusters of protection from the effects of a crisis, that they remain able to carry on. This has been proven statistically. I haven't seen more recent studies, but studies from the early 1990s clearly showed that one of the problems of promoting democracy through economic sanctions is that many times the intended governments are autocracies that do not respond as we expect them, by punishing them economically. So Maduro has been able to insulate important sectors of the pillars that support him from the vestiges of the crisis. The fact that they're a minority in Congress, they use the judicial shield to basically declare the National Assembly to be essentially illegal and not paying any attention to anything that they do. So most of the laws and studies that the National Assembly have tried to do are simply not taken care of. Let me just say one thing. You might ask, could they do an impeachment in Venezuela? And the answer is they can't do an impeachment. Thank you, Hugo Chavez. In Venezuela, there used to be the possibility of an impeachment prior to Chavez, but Chavez changed the constitution, deleted the impeachment procedure, replacing it with a recall referendum. Back then, people thought that this was more democratic, more participatory. A recall referendum gave the people, not the politicians, the keys to power. Now we know better that in reality, it was a gimmick. The recall referendum is so difficult, and in Venezuela, given the rules for conducting it, which are so strict, that it's really not that great of a tool. So they cannot impeach. They could try to do a recall referendum. They only had 1 year to do it. They managed to get to follow all the steps to start the recall referendum, but they were blocked from doing so by the electoral authorities. Now, let me say something about street protests, and then one more point, and then I'll conclude. It is remarkable that there aren't more street protests now, but only if you don't understand how exhausted Venezuelans are from trying to survive in what is now becoming one of the most unlivable countries in the Americas. Nevertheless, that is not the only explanation. It's not just exhaustion from trying to survive adversity, but also repression. It's very important that we keep this in mind. This administration has really applied important levels of repression that work. During the 2014 protests, there were about 3,000 house arrests. This is important because you want to, one thing is to arrest people who are outside protesting, but another thing is for the state officials to go into people's homes after the protest and take individuals away from their households. This has an incredibly chilling effect. And in many ways, this type of repression, although the mass numbers of 2014 haven't recurred, there is systematic increase in detentions. There were at least 2,000 last year, and Venezuelans know that they could very easily see their lives their liberties completely ended, because this is an instrument that the regime is now using systematically, frequently, and in my opinion, with success in deterring the rise of protests. Finally, this is really the most interesting thing. When I was in graduate school back in the 1990s, my dissertation was about whether ruling parties were supporting the president or not, and so I'm generally, I think I have I pay some attention to this, and I have to say it is really remarkable how few big people in the government have defected. There have been some, but I think what you might disagree, but what I think is so interesting is how they have all stuck together. There isn't the proverbial split between hardliners and softliners or disenchanted Chavistas. If they are, they have left unceremoniously and having no impact. I think the reason for this is that Maduro, and most scholars agree with this, is not the towering leader that we had with Chavez, who was the final decision maker, but he has morphed Chavismo into a sort of like collegial rule. Everybody is allowed to have its own fiefdom. Different sectors of the civilian establishment have power pockets that they enjoy. Maybe at some point I made the mistake of saying personally that Maduro had become a puppet. Probably that was an overstatement. But I still think it is correct that he takes cues from others rather than him providing more cues, and that this form of accommodation has allowed him to maintain a certain degree of esprit de corps among the Chavistas. So let me now conclude, and then we can go to the comments. You know, I always think that the discussants provide really the most interesting points after a talk. But here for you, I am highlighting my central argument, which is, as I said, and to repeat, number one, it could very well be that in terms of all the potential political crises that one can expect, the regime is not quite there yet. But also, and this is point number two, the regime, by turning more autocratic and shaping autocracy in the direction of responding through these mechanisms, has been able to insulate itself from what could otherwise be a real danger for the survival of this regime. And so, to conclude, I don't think we're going to see the end of the Maduro administration in the near term unless things change. But if they stay this way, I expect continuity. Thank you very much. Those were my remarks.
We'll have a period for questions after the two commentaries that we'll listen to now. The first one by our esteemed friend and colleague, Gustavo Coronel.
Well, I have one slide, but before I show it, I would like to comment quite briefly on Javier's very organized presentation. I do believe that Javier's presentation gives a very good historical recollection of why Maduro has not yet been overthrown. I doubt that his approach has a predictive value. I think it's very valuable for the things that have happened so far. I am not so sure that it will serve to predict whether Maduro will fall briefly or not. For example, I see that he has made Maduro, or he has put under Maduro, three factors of the, and he says that, if I remember correctly, he says that probably at least four factors or more are required for a government to be ousted. I believe that Maduro has more than three factors, according to the tabulation that we saw. For example, he mentions that there is no judicial, rather that there is no crisis regarding the judicial aspect. Let me see exactly what the situation is here. Well, maybe you can, is it possible for you to put the last slide of Javier? Mm-hmm. Well, don't worry. We won't have to wait. One aspect or here we are. Javier says no constitutional crisis in Venezuela. Now, because the judicial shield is killing or suppressing the constitutional crisis. But of course, the existence of this duplicity between the judicial power and the legislative power is in itself one of the greatest constitutional crises that we have ever had in Venezuela. So the fact that there is a judicial shield does not make the constitutional crisis disappear. So I believe there is a very strong constitutional crisis going on in Venezuela. He also says that there is no electoral crisis because simply they are suppressing elections. The fact that they are suppressing elections in Venezuela today intensify the likelihood of other aspects emerging in Venezuela, like street protests. There will have to be a point in which Venezuelans will realize that the only way to change things in Venezuela is through civic action or insurgents, because the electoral path is completely closed. Javier, for example, I think he has not mentioned something that I believe is playing a very important role nowadays. I am talking of external pressure. I don't see external pressure there as a factor. I know that in Argentina, external pressure has been a factor, a very strong factor. And now in Venezuela, as you can see from what the OAS is doing, there is a very strong external pressure. Even if the OAS is not doing exactly what it should be doing, they now have 20 countries calling Venezuela to either for elections or to be expelled from the organization. And I believe that this external pressure is mounting even more so. So I would say basically, looking at the scheme of Javier, that probably Maduro has maybe 4 or even 5 factors playing into his potential ousting. That's basically what I wanted to say about Javier's presentation. And I have one slide that more empirically shows my reasons why I believe Maduro still is in power. And 2 of these reasons are external, and the other 2 reasons are domestic reasons. The first reason, which is an external reason, is that the amount of money, the amount of money that Chavez and Maduro have had, have led to the co-opting of not only countries in Latin America, but also the people inside the country. You have to see, for example, what is going on in the OAS. So far, in the OAS, the only countries blocking a severe sanction against Venezuela are the countries from the Petrocaribe area and the ALBA group. And basically the Petrocaribe area, with maybe 2% of the population, are blocking the sanctions against Venezuela against the 98% of the rest of the countries. So I believe the oil money has been the main factor why Chavez first and Maduro later have remained in power. The second reason, I believe, has to do with conflicting and short-term national interests. For example, 2 countries. The U.S., for several years now, the United States has been the main supporter of the Maduro regime under the Obama presidency. And now we see in retrospective how Thomas Shannon in the Department of State was the main factor in keeping the concept of the dialogue surviving, in spite of the knowledge that we all have that this famous dialogue is not only immoral, but also strategically useless. And now you still see in the OAS yesterday most of the countries calling for a dialogue between the narco regime and the victims of the narco regime. I say that it's almost like calling for Hitler sitting around the table with the Jewish population that was in their way to the crematories. Not as extreme as that, but certainly that's probably a similar example. So the U.S. has been the main supporter of the Maduro regime. But now, as we know, this has changed radically with the new administration in the White House. Not that I support the new administration, but in this particular case, is looking like doing the right thing. The other country that had conflicting national interests with and supported Maduro is or has been and still is Colombia. Colombia, Venezuela's neighbor, needs Venezuela or needs Maduro to be his main supporter with his love affair with the FARC. As long as this link, these peace conversations and negotiations were underway, Santos could not afford to antagonize Maduro. And still, Maduro is a hot potato for President Santos. And you could see in the OAS yesterday how Colombia spoke of dialogue, of civilized dialogue. It never spoke about sanctions against Venezuela. Now, the third reason has to do with the prostitution of the Venezuelan armed forces. It's not that the armed forces in Venezuela have ever been a positive factor in Venezuelan history, but now it's totally disastrous. The Venezuelan armed forces are now leading the narco traffic, as Javier has suggested. Not only that, they have in their hands the food distribution in Venezuela. What they are distributing is what is left after they themselves satisfy their own requirements. But what they are doing is to sell or resell these food bags that are imported at a cost of $800 per bag and have a real value of maybe $80 or $90 per bag. And the rest of the money is pocketed by the Venezuelan armed forces. Now, as long as the armed forces in Venezuela are supporting the regime, in fact, as long as the armed forces in Venezuela are in power, because forget about Maduro, the real power in Venezuela is the armed forces. The fourth reason, the final reason, is a combination of very severe government controls, price controls, exchange controls, all kinds of controls that you can imagine, together with what I call elegantly, so to speak, weak civic response, not to say cowardice from many of the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition. there are certainly heroes in Venezuela among the opposition leaders. They are all in prison. And the ones who are not in prison are actually looking for an accommodation with the Maduro government, because they have been, after so many years and after so much money running around in the country, they have been progressively co-opted by the regime. So this combination of four reasons explain why Maduro is still in power. This doesn't mean to say that this is going to stay like this for the foreseeable future. For example, oil money is running out very quickly. Petrocaribe still works, but is so much weaker now that at any moment this Caribbean states blocking the OAS will break away. Conflicting national interests. I don't believe Santos will change his attitude in the coming months, but certainly the U.S. has already changed its attitude. The armed forces, I think, are a hopeless case, because they will only concede Maduro's ousting when all of the other reasons are so strong that they cannot stop doing anything about it. But they have to resist until the last minute, because they are involved in big crimes against the Venezuelan nation. They are involved in narco-trafficking and in grand larceny in Venezuela. So they will be the last bastion of resistance in favor of Maduro. And finally, government controls and civic response. Today in Venezuela, the opposition is being replaced progressively by a real opposition. The mood, as you know it, is no longer effective. Is being replaced by civic groups that represent a wider aspect of civil society. There is a group called Ghana, which is, as its name suggests, is gaining a lot of ground lately. So I believe that in a reasonable short term, Maduro will be ousted. I am convinced that he will not finish his normal term for 2019 or 18 or whatever. So thank you very much.
We'll have the opportunity to come back to the presentations of our speakers, and we'll complete the roll call here with Professor Hector Schamis.
Go there, all right.
Yeah. Como querrás.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for invitation. Thank you, Javier. And Javier was talking about when he was in grad school, and that, of course, reminded me of how old we've become. And ever since those good times, we've been friends for that long. And I'm not going to give you guys the number. But Javier is a great scholar, great friend, great guy, and his work is always terrific. I came here. I don't know who's responsible for the title of the session, but I find it mysterious, and therefore, I think it's Jaime who always comes up with these things that make you think. And so I prepared a couple of notes on the title, and then I wrote lots of notes about Javier's presentation and also Gustavo's comments that were right on the money on a number of issues, I believe. So I'm going to try to, all of this in 5 minutes to reconcile everything and deal with that. So let me start also trying to reconcile the theory driving work that Javier presented with the more political, specific, day-to-day issues that are important to understand what's going on, but also were highlighted by Gustavo. And those things, never go, not always go together. I mean, well, when you deal with, building a parsimonious explanation, well, you sacrifice detail by definition, and then in the process, you sort of, you don't, I'm sorry? You don't necessarily speak of, you lose some of the details that allow you to explain and understand a particular case, but that is the trade-off of, the field. Let me say a couple of things. I mean, first thing I thought when I saw mysterious resilience of the Maduro regime is that according to some other theory out there, there's no mystery and there's no anomaly. Why? Well, because in the first place, Venezuela, according to that theory, is not supposed to have a democracy in the first place, to begin with. Yeah, I mean, that's the theory on the political economy of the resource curse. I mean, countries endowed with exportable natural resources, oil, minerals, or diamonds, the economy is highly concentrated on that sector. It crowds out investment on the other sectors. The economy depends on the price cycles of that staple, and therefore accounts for a very particular economic profile of the country, which also requires pretty much full control of the state apparatus, and therefore democracy is unlikely. Gulf countries, Gulf in the Asian Gulf, in the Gulf Sea, those countries are not democracies. And in a way, Venezuela was the anomaly of that back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I was always puzzled by Terry Carl's comment in her chapter in the Transitions volume, and don't cry, but when she says that oil paid the bill for democracy in Venezuela, she has that sentence, which, according to the theory on the political economy of the resource curse, it wasn't supposed to happen in the first place. So that was perhaps the anomaly, the ability of an elite, of a political elite, to make that deal that took them there and sustained them in power until the cycle changed, by the way, in the 80s, and with the drop in the price of oil in the 80s, and then the rest is history. The crisis of Carlos Andrés Pérez, and then Chavez, and so on and so forth. So back to the original argument I had, then the resilience is based on the super cycle. Oil over 130 for quite some time, that was the peak, but stay around 100. I mean, a super cycle of commodities that all the countries in Latin America experience, and that in some sense Venezuela is unique, but in some other sense is not unique, because the other countries in Latin America went through similar cycle with more or less similar effects over the political process. The second thing, why the resilience, is foreign policy. Gustavo made a comment about that, mentioned that, and indeed, yesterday at the OAS, I was there, and it's still, Suriname changed, its vote, and Antigua this or that, and the little Caribbean islands, there are, 0.3% of the population of the inter-American system, and nonetheless have a few votes necessary for the Venezuelan regime to find its way. But it's not only that Petrocaribe was wealthy and had an enormous amount of resources, it's also that they were very smart, and they keep being very, very smart. I mean, we don't give them credit as foreign policy makers. We don't give them enough credit. In the art of mastering foreign policy. Those scenes that we get so horrified and scandals play a role as well. Third thing is, I must say, a word that has been mentioned here, paradoxically, I haven't heard the word pronounced. Third factor has a word which is Cuba. The strategic, profound, and deep presence of Cuba in Venezuelan politics. Javier mentioned repression. Repression is Cuba-style repression, and that's why it's so effective. It's a carbon copy. I mean, it's it's the Cubans. Going to see the civil society leaders after the rally, getting them out of the home, is Cuba 101. The other reason, there's been a comment by Gustavo, and I agree on that. Javier didn't mention it, and you have to, Javier. It's the opposition. Maduro is in power because of the opposition. Gustavo said that, well, reliable leaders are at home, home arrest, like Antonio Ledesma, or in jail, like Leopoldo Lopez and many others. But I think that basically the mood is in the mud. Let's put it that way. And that's serious because Javier doesn't have in his chart the issue of street protests. And there's been street protests until the end of October, which, and Caracas had, about, 2-3 million people on the streets that day. And Mood gave them all away. Henry Ramos, Enrique Capriles, and the others gave them all away. That's the truth. They gave away the fact that Venezuelan people had registered to vote in the recall referendum, risking their jobs and their pensions and their grants for students and so on and so forth. And they registered in extraordinary numbers. And yet they gave them away, all in a very, still to me, incomprehensible way, in exchange for nothing. So that with regards to the opposition. Something also I had was about the future. Well, the future is to leave power. I mean, that's after 18 years you have to leave power. If you don't leave power, well, then this is what's going to happen. But at the same time, this ain't no Augusto Pinochet. Meaning what? And Javier touches upon that a little bit with and Gustavo highlighted that also, is that there is no Augusto Pinochet in the sense that that was an authoritarian regime that wrote the rules of how and when it would leave power. It's in the 1980 Constitution. There's going to be, in 1980 they wrote, there's going to be a plebiscite in 1988, the famous plebiscite of 1988. There's going to be a plebiscite if the no wins, then we're going to call for an election next year. And exactly that's what happened. True, there were some elements within the authoritarian bloc at the time that wanted to reject the results that night. But in the end they didn't. And that makes all the difference, because that's not how the Venezuelan regime seized power, largely since the influence of Cuba increased dramatically. Maduro goes to Havana to get advice and comes back weekly. And that is something that didn't happen to that extent with Chavez. And that is not that Maduro is a Marxist-Leninist or anything, or it doesn't matter. What matters is that he's very short of international support, and then, the Cuban advice is important. And the other part of the deal with Colombia, I believe, has been Cuba, Gustavo, which, has given the sort of a comfort zone to the Maduro regime, this triangular negotiation. The Obama administration, new diplomatic relations with Cuba, and the Colombian peace process. And that has given a comfort zone. 1/3 of the ELN resides in Venezuela. They get in, they get out, and so on and so forth, and et cetera, et cetera. One more thing I wanted to say, or something about Javier's point. The military has many functions. True. I think there is something new, a sort of a general point about transitions, because Javier does make the point about hardliners, softliners, and so on and so forth. and that there's no such a thing within the Venezuelan military, as there were within the Pinochet regime, the Uruguayan regime, the Argentine regime during the transitions in the 80s. And I think it has to do with the business of the military, whether that is food and that is, which entails a paradoxical thing, I think, in terms of hardliners and softliners. There is division within the armed forces, but it's a business division. It's a division over the markets, it's a division over the goods they deliver, it's a division over whether they are on drugs or on smuggling goods from Colombia, or whether they are into food distribution, or whether they have their hands on the humanitarian relief packages that they sell in the black market. Which also is interesting. It doesn't produce, paradoxically, there is a division because there are competing interests, competing firms, if you want, but doesn't produce a political division. Why? Because they cannot conceive of themselves out of power. Being out of power, unlike Pinochet, who could be out of power, although in the end he faced a crazy Spanish judge, right crazy for himself at the time, a Spanish judge that, held him, detained in London. But what we are facing in Latin America is something very new and very peculiar. And Venezuela is, I think, the paradigmatic case, but it's not the only one. Corruption, Latin America was always very corrupt, right? Well, corrupt Latin American public official is it's a story. But that has changed. It used to be that guy that had a cut for himself. There was a guy that was in charge of a contract, building a bridge, supplying, uniforms for the military or whatever you want. There was that guy that was what's in there for me, Mr. 10% or something like that. Different names by which, we knew the public sector was corrupt. There are different interpretations for that, whether that's good, bad, or whatnot. That has changed. Corruption is not anymore that guy that is seeking private profit. Corruption has become a system of domination. The corrupt schemes in Latin America have replaced the political system. They organize the territory, they control the territory, and they divide the territory politically. Well, this territory is yours for whatever you do, smuggling drugs or whatever else. This territory is for me, and there are clashes at the boundaries. Corruption finances politics, big time. It finances campaigns. Corruption does foreign policy. Nobody remembers that Dilma Rousseff went to inaugurate the Mariel harbor in Cuba, and next to her, who was honored by her, just like the other, read her speech that afternoon. Mr. President Castro, Mr. President, all the presidents of Latin America were there next to her, and acknowledged was Mr. Marcelo Odebrecht, who built the harbor. What that means is that Dilma used to go on trips with Marcelo Odebrecht, and this is what we're all looking at, who's going to fall next, right? What's going to happen? Santos is cornered right now because of that. Well, his campaign manager received money, but he had no clue. Whoever has been 5 minutes in a campaign knows that the campaign manager knows the socks the candidate is wearing that day, and vice versa. So what this means is that it's paradoxical in terms of transition literature, Javier, I think. There is division, but it's a business division that makes them very homogeneous and cohesive in terms of the politics. Because there is one thing they all have in common, no matter what conflicts they may have over the business, which is power. Out of power, they may end up in jail. The example that we have to think about, which is a dramatically powerful educational example for the Maduro regime, for the Chavistas, is Argentina. where they were so, quote unquote, stupid that they gave power. And now there is a long line of people going to jail and people being charged with all kinds of things, including the former president. Being out of power is very risky, and that is the biggest problem there is now. This is why there is no negotiation, pretty much. There is this, a todo nada, right? And this is the drama of democracy in the region on the one hand, but also putting together a democratic transition in Venezuela. Thanks so much.
We'll give now Mr. Corrales, Professor Corrales, a chance to refer to his to the commentaries made to his presentation by our colleagues here.
Is this on? Yeah. I feel very fortunate. Thank you, Gustavo and Hector. Those were great comments. I love that we're adding to the list of, I don't disagree with anything that you all added. I apologize if my list was incomplete. I recognize I don't have any criticisms or reservations about what you guys said. Let me say one thing about the United States, just not a major disagreement, but perhaps a different nuance, and then say something about the last point that Hector made about being comfortable being as an opposition. I understand the point that the United States has not been leading the charge against the Maduro and even earlier the Chavez administration. I agree. And more could have been done, but they have nonetheless, the United States has been the actor that has produced the most debilitating blows from outside up until now. They were not hard punches necessarily, but they were punches, and that is the work that the FBI and the Treasury Department do. This is what Obama did. He turned the foreign policy of the United States toward Venezuela away from the State Department, away from Congress, and gave it to the FBI and Treasury Department. There's more nuance there than just being supported. It is true. It's not it hasn't been a concerted effort to topple the regime. That I agree. But at the same time, it has also been the most important, serious external problem that that Venezuela has faced. It's not a dismissible policy. And then this is the last thing I want to say. I love that you brought us to theory. I love thinking about how there is reason to believe that resource curse theory overpredicts the survival of authoritarianism. Empirically, I don't want to get into the details. We know that the case is not as strong as we would like it to believe. If you control for Arabness, you have more variation in regime type, even in Venezuela. But you're absolutely right. That line of thinking says it's very difficult to topple petrostates. Very, very difficult, especially if they turn more autocratic. There's no disagreement there. This is perhaps what the Venezuelan opposition is up against. This is what makes the Venezuelan opposition so different from other oppositions, because they have to topple a petrostate that is increasingly more authoritarian. And then Hector made a point that I think is worth restating, because it's really, I think, also crucial. In democratic theory, we came to the understanding in the 1980s that the incumbents have to feel safe moving to the opposition. Every political actor in a democracy has to come to believe that being in power does not mean that they will win everything, and being in opposition, you're in opprobrium, you're in no gains. And unless you get and in democracy, you always need an opposition, so you cannot have democracy with opposition, but the opposition has to feel that they can be safe. And we're not there in Venezuela. This is the point that Hector makes, and to some extent Gustavo alluded to, and that is that they're very afraid to be in the opposition, and for whatever reasons, the military or other folks. And I have to say that this is a very powerful argument. If I have a criticism of the opposition, I probably wouldn't be as tough as you were, Gustavo. I always praise the opposition in Venezuela. I always say that in no other Latin American country have we seen this level of unity. Have we seen this rise from the ashes? Have we seen this ability to match the electoral strength of Chavismo? But having said that, perhaps its biggest failing has been to not create an environment for the worst offenders to feel that it is safe to step outside. In fact, Henry Ramos Alup had a big blunder recently. Who knows if this is ethically correct to think about making safe spaces for the opposition, but I think that until we're there, there's going to be a lot of hesitation to break away from Maduro. Those were my points. Thank you very much to the two of you. I love them.
Very good. You have any thoughts on this?
Well, actually, I think I failed to emphasize the connection between the Obama administration, the Cuban government, and the Venezuelan government. I believe that this is a very strong link. Obama wanted his legacy was to leave Cuba as under the democratic umbrella of the Americas, and for this he felt he could sacrifice the democracy in Venezuela for a few more years, leaving Maduro in charge. I believe that he failed in Cuba, and he has also failed in Venezuela. What Javier says is probably softened by the fact that the main efforts in the U.S. against the Maduro regime were not made by the Department of State, but they were made by the FBI and by investigative organizations, and also fundamentally by the Senate, by the Congress of the United States. They were the ones that kept pressuring Obama, and Obama kept resisting up to the last minute.
Hector?
No, it's just one thing. On Javier's comment about, well, it's very difficult to topple a petro-state. Indeed, even more so a petro-narco state. That's the point I wanted to make, which is in so many ways unique. This is the country with the largest reserves of oil in the world, where the state is in control of a criminal organization or sets of organizations. The Treasury Department report on the vice president is absolutely demolishing. But it's not the first time either. When Roverol was in charge, he was made interior minister to grant him immunity at the same time. This is it's a state that responds on behalf of criminals. That's the word, and that makes it all the more difficult.
Okay, now a few questions from our esteemed guest today. I will kindly request to give us name and affiliation.
Sure. My name is Rex Wempen with Northern Resource. And my question to the esteemed panel, thank you for all the presentations, all very informative. One topic which was not covered, I hope that you all may briefly comment, with all due respect to the powerful role, for better or worse, that the United States played in this hemisphere during the Cold War. Since the Cold War, new power centers in the world have emerged. And I was hoping that you may comment on the perhaps significant impact that Chinese and to a lesser extent Russian investment in Venezuela may have had in the continuation of the regime. Thank you.
Well,
want to go ahead?
Wants to.
Oh, okay. No, absolutely. China has been the most important support of Venezuela. That's absolutely clear, and bailing them out. It could very well be that if we talk to folks in Beijing, they probably would treat Venezuela as their first example of their foreign aid going badly. The United States has plenty of examples of that, but Venezuela is probably the one. But they have not pulled the plug, and until then, that's a big issue. With Russia, that's complicated. Russia currently, right now, is not helping Venezuela that much, because Russia is not complying with cutbacks in oil production, which would be the best thing that Russia could do now, is to cut back. But in general, they have helped protect the regime. But right now, Russia is not exactly helping Venezuela right now.
Okay. Yes.
My name is Elvira Banks. I'm a Venezuelan American. I just have a question, talking about the money-wise. Venezuela's oil, of course, is going downhill, but drug trafficking is very lucrative. So my question is, considering the case of the narco-sobrinos, the Celia's nephews, I'm not going into details, and the proof of Tarek al-Aissami involved in terrorism, which no one has mentioned, terrorism and drug trafficking. So Venezuela is a global menace. So after all these, is there any way, one way of getting Maduro out of the regime, because Venezuela is a menace? Sad to say, I'm Venezuelan. Is there any way to have, an international coalition or another OAS or whatever, or United Nations working on Venezuela, considering the drug trafficking, which is already proved, and the terrorism?
This has been the real difficulty. We have had a very difficult time. I don't know what has been harder, to get the United States to get more decisive, or to get Latin Americans to even care about the subject. We are now at a situation where, for the first time, there is the possibility of an international Latin American coalition, but it has taken so long to form, and it doesn't have that much power. So I wouldn't be too optimistic of an international coalition. Having said that, and Hector was there, the OAS, what we saw this week is really huge. Seeing Mexico, which is the country in the Americas that respects sovereignty as if it were the country that has the most to hide, leading the effort to try to sanction Venezuela, the OAS, is major. So we're at a good point with this, although clearly not good enough to produce enough pressure. Gustavo mentioned the external pressure, and from my count, 4 of the 20 interrupted presidencies came down because of serious external pressure. So it's absolutely true that it can do the job. But the problem with Chavismo is that, in addition to being a petrostate, narco state, it has a lot of soft power among the left. And for a while, Latin America was dominated by leftist governments, and that reduced the chances of diplomacy working to change the regime in Venezuela.
Yes.
Yes, Duke Banks. Say I'm from the Coordinadora Internacional Venezolana, which is an opposition group that was formed here about 12 years ago. I'm Venezuelan American also. I guess more for Hector, because I saw you at the OAS for the Human Rights Forum about Venezuela last week, and you mentioned about, you have to give credit to the Venezuelan regime in foreign relations. At that forum, which you might want to elaborate, was how disruptive the end was, that basically there was no questions and answers because of what happened. And also yesterday at the OAS, the closing kind of show that the Venezuelan vice minister put on, insulting everybody to the point that the Mexican ambassador got up and in English scolded him for not maintaining decor. There seems to be an element of disruption and kind of, throwing out the cards as a way of kind of survival. And I guess at what point is the Americans, other countries going to say, we're fed up with this?
I agree, but if you're fed up, the worst you can do is to react, because that's the game, and to disrupt the conversation about the issues, right? I mean, it's like pretty much every political operation knows that the important thing is to change the agenda, and then the agenda is no longer human rights violations in Venezuela, but the agenda is the show that foreign policy officials put together, right? And yeah, the Mexicans reacted in a very un-Mexican way, by the way, because they are very professional and particularly this ambassador, who I agree with Javier, his speech yesterday at the OAS was absolutely magnificent, but also historical, precisely because of what you just said. I mean, this is the country that has made non-intervention in other countries' internal politics, particularly Latin American internal politics, the center of its foreign policy. And then yesterday was just, we witnessed history yesterday in terms of, Mexican foreign policy, historically speaking, I mean, in time, over time. But yes, that's what happens. That's what they're going to keep doing, I think. And the issue is that also we have to keep in mind this. Last year in June, in that session Almagro convoked for Article 20. Now we are in 20 and a half, perhaps, because we're not there 21 yet, which is vote for suspension or anything like that, which is not, really the way to go, I don't think. But for 10 years, the OAS was a ministry of Hugo Chavez, turning the organization into complete irrelevance. It was, the really, that election to approve the Orden del Día last year in June, that it was, Almagro had the votes, and then we had the votes to discuss. That's what we're talking about. Was the first time any discussion on Venezuela had the vote to take place in 10 years. Well, the price of oil began to decline already in 2011, 2012. This is, perhaps the inertia of that time, but also the effectiveness of Venezuelan foreign policy in all this to control that particular space. And that has begun to change. Well, because the deterioration is big, the OAS is in different hands, the hemisphere is changing. I was thinking, I was there and Ecuador voted with Venezuela yesterday, and I was sitting next to someone and I said, until Sunday. Perhaps. We don't know, obviously, but, this is the change of cycle this has been the super cycle of the commodities that allow this group of people to borrow a very effective discourse from Cuba about perpetuation and enjoy 10, 15 plus years of good business, corruption, and full control of the state apparatus. All of this with a pretense, revolution, people, you name it, right? Which is an additional tragedy, I think, which is the tragedy of the Latin American left post this cycle, which I think Almagro tries to sort of represent that other voice. He's someone from the left. He was foreign minister of Mujica. But he expresses that left that, with all this, will be divorced from human rights, democracy, separation of power, constitutional arrangements, and so on and so forth. And that's another tragedy, the next tragedy, what's going to happen with the left in Latin America.
We still have time for one last question. The gentleman here at my right. Yeah.
I am Reynaldo Rojas. I am Venezuelan American too. I'm going to make a comment. I went to school in Ohio Wesleyan University and Xavier University in Ohio some years ago. And people used to ask me, where is Venezuela? Almost no one knew where's that little country. And I used to say Venezuela is where the Andean mountains, the Caribbean Sea, and the Amazonian jungle gather. Go and check it in a map. Right now, if some people ask me, where's Venezuela, or what is Venezuela? I would say Venezuela is where the Cuban regime, the American government, the Chinese, and the Russians gather. Go and see what their interests are in Venezuela, and you'll find out why is that resilience of the Maduro regime. The point I'm making is that Venezuela for the last 18 years had been the piñata of the Americas. Everyone wanted a piece of Venezuela. And right now, there are some of them that they know they have to leave the party, and some of them, they want to keep partying in our country. Thank you.
Well, what I want to say in the last instance is that the thing that we have to do in Venezuela is to go on civic insurgency. We have delayed civic insurgency for too long a time, talking about alternatives that never were realized. We went after elections. That path is closed to us. We went after dialogue. That path is closed to us. The only way open to us today is going on a civic insurgency mode. We have to go and protest against the dictatorship. It's not a government. It's a narco regime. And until we realize who are we up against, Venezuela will keep muddling through. But again, I am in a minority in Venezuela. The majority in Venezuela is still dreaming of dialogue, still dreaming of elections, and of accommodation with the regime. I don't believe this is possible.
Okay. This unfortunately has come to the end. Why don't we give a round of applause to our fantastic panel? Thank you very much.